how Zestmoney basically achieved an 80% KYC conversion by building a KYC waterfall system. Now, before I go into what is this, I'll talk a little bit about what KYC is and why it's important. Okay, so KYC stands for Know Your Customer. So every regulated entity, and in this case study, let's restrict it to RBI regulated entities. Okay, so Zestmoney was indirectly an RBI regulated entity. Zestmoney had an NBFC. So banks and NBFCs typically are regulated by the RBI, and RBI mandates that these entities should know the identity of the customers that they're onboarding, right? And that process is what is called the KYC process, where they validate and ensure that the identity of the person that they're onboarding is who they are claiming to be, right? That is what KYC is. Now, another thing about the RBI is they never say to the letter that this is how you should do KYC, right? RBI issues a set of guidelines for KYC, and the regulated entities then have to follow those guidelines, or rather follow the intent of those guidelines, and then carry out the KYC process, which means they don't spell out exactly you have to do step A, B, C, or 1, 2, 3. The RBI never says that, right? Which means there is a lot of interpretation that happens on the part of the regulated entities, and various regulated entities typically have fall anywhere on the spectrum of being, being a very or having a very strict read of the KYC guidelines versus being a little bit more lax on the KYC guidelines, right? That's completely up to the regulated entity. But having said that, over time, the standards sort of converge to what is accepted by the RBI and the regulated entities as an acceptable form of KYC, right? Now, any entity that is operating within the purview of the RBI has to go through this KYC process for their customers, or rather has to get the customer to do the KYC process, right? Now, in Zestmoney's case, primarily, our objective of this step, this is a mandatory step, right? Because we are indirectly a regulated entity. We had our own NBFC, but moreover, we work with 26 lending partners, which were all RBI regulated, and thus had to do the KYC process, right? So our objective out of this was be compliant, be 100% compliant in terms of what the RBI is prescribing. To maximize maximize coverage, right? Which means if you're onboarding 100 customers, should get as close to 100 as possible so that all of them can complete the KYC process and get the product, which in our case was a loan, right? Minimize the friction in the process, right? Which means the process should be as smooth as possible so that the customer can complete this easily and actually get the product that they desire, right? Now, B and C combined is what you call conversion, right? Which means if 100 people start the flow, how many people are getting through to the end of the flow and completing it? So we actually built a system. Our solution to solve these three problems, ABC, was to build a system of waterfall. Now, what do I mean by waterfall? Waterfall is where you use multiple modes of KYC. So I talked about this KYC guidelines. Based on these KYC guidelines, there are different modes through which you can validate the identity of a customer, right? And these different modes have different benefits, pros and cons, basically, right? Now, this waterfall system of KYC would basically have different modes back to back, so that if one particular mode fails or a customer is not able to do a particular mode for any reason, it can be friction, it can be because the coverage is not there for that particular customer, they can fall back on another mode, right? The net result is that the entity that is doing this benefits from a wider acceptance, wider coverage, and thus higher conversion.